Well, let's start off with the militarization of our law enforcement. A real warrior on this issue is Radley Balko, and he talks about the issue in the next video. Let's take a look.
Explain how we've gotten to this point now in 2013 where the line is so blurred between military soldier and cop.
Yeah, so this is an important line that we've respected for a long time in this country, this idea that, you know, soldiers and police have very different missions, and it's dangerous to start to conflate the two in a free society. And what's happened over the last generation or so, it began with the drug war, is the Pentagon started giving away this military equipment to police agencies across the country, and we're talking, you know, tanks and armored personnel carriers, helicopters, you know, high-powered weapons, bayonets for some reason. Police agencies love bayonets. And so once they have this equipment, then they've started forming these SWAT teams. The increase in the number of SWAT teams across the country is really dramatic. In the early 80s, about 15% of towns of 25,000 or more people had a SWAT team. Today, it's well over 80%. And the total number of SWAT raids has gone from about 3,000 per year, actually from a few hundred per year in the 70s to a few thousand per year in the 80s to 50,000 SWAT raids per year in this country today.
So this really seems like a domino effect of the military-industrial complex, right? We have all of these weapons. We now use drones, and apparently Americans are okay with the U.S. government using drones. And we're starting to see it shifting from the military to local law enforcement. And it's definitely problematic because we don't need a militarized law enforcement. We need to focus on crime and dealing with crime in a good, safe way that isn't going to be destructive to society. We don't need these crazy weapons in our law enforcement to actually enforce the law and to, you know, deal with crime. But I do want to give you guys some information on SWAT teams that I found really fascinating. So the number of SWAT teams in the U.S. grew by 500 in 1975, or by 1975. By 1982, nearly 60% of American cities with 50,000 or more people had a SWAT team. By 1995, nearly 90% of cities with 50,000 or more people had one or more SWAT teams, which is incredible. And recently there was this story about an organic farm in Arlington, Texas, that was raided because officials believed that there was marijuana being grown in the organic farm. When they showed up, first of all, there was no marijuana being grown, and they confiscated all of these random plants like berry plants and things like that. But the reaction to that situation was ridiculous. They had helicopters, they had a full-on raid of an organic farm, and even if they did have marijuana on that farm, I mean, I feel like that was just excessive action by law enforcement. Now, first question goes to Mike. Mike, I mean, do you feel like this level of militarization is something that Americans are aware of, or do you think that we're just kind of asleep at the wheel while this is all happening?
Well, I think people are aware that it's happening because we can see it. I mean, you see the armored personnel carriers. You see the cops decked out in more military gear than I saw special forces troops wearing in Iraq. So visually, it's striking, and visually, it's evident that this transition has happened and has been taking place over the past several decades. But what I think people don't really grasp is what the reasons for it are. I mean, since this became a thing, which was really the late 60s and early 70s, it's all been cloaked in this idea of law and order politics as being necessary to fight crime and things like that. But we're actually looking at how these things are being implemented. We see something very different. And I think a good example is with the Occupy movement. There, the militarization of the police was on full display with all of this riot gear, fancy equipment, and so forth. All we were being told is that this is to stop crime that's happening, there's drug use, things like that. But in reality, it was infringing on the rights of free speech and freedom of assembly for people. And so I think while we're seeing visually what's happening, we need to be paying attention to what the causes of it are.
Absolutely. And, you know, specifically with the Occupy movement, I saw the police force as being intimidating. It was a way of intimidating the activists, and obviously that was something that kind of destroyed the movement. I hate to say that, but Occupy no longer really exists in the way that they did originally. And another thing to keep in mind, at the time the Occupy protests really started firing up, some of the big banks made massive donations to the NYPD. Why do you think they did that? It's because they wanted them to intimidate some of the protesters. But Jimmy, what do you think the reaction will be in the future? Do you think Americans are actually going to do something to stop this? Or do you think Americans think that this is keeping us safe? This is actually decreasing crime?
Oh, Americans are always protecting their civil liberties. Don't you see it? No, you know, 80% of Americans now think that the government is not only listening to their phone calls and reading their emails, but they feel that they're also using that information for things that don't have to do with terrorism, and still half the people in this country are okay with it. So it turns out that the terrorists hate our freedom, and half the people in the country aren't big on it either. So I think that when people, you know, how many people have said this? Hey, if you don't have anything to hide, what are you afraid of the police for? Well, you know, the police aren't always the good guys, you know? They're sometimes the bad guys. When you see those SWAT teams all dressed up in more military gear than a guy in Iraq, I'm sure what's on his mind is protecting the Constitution. I'm sure that's what they're thinking about. And people say you can't generalize about the cops. And I try not to generalize the cops. Like when I look at Occupy Wall Street and in New York City and how they treated the people there, I guess all the good cops were on vacation those months. Where were all the good cops standing up for the citizens' right to petition their government? Where were those people? They were nowhere. They were macing women and pregnant women and old ladies, and they were harassing citizens. So this whole idea of you can't generalize about cops being bad or good, it's a culture. Or it's right. It's like they don't just pluck cops out of the random population randomly. Those are people who are thrill seekers who get a kick out of it. That's why they're cops. If I was a cop and I heard that there was a shooting somewhere, I'd get in my car and drive the other fucking way, which is why I'm not a cop. Right. Cops love that shit, which is why they are cops and they drive towards it, okay?
I'm going to disagree with you a little bit. I think that is a bit of a generalization. There are people who want to be cops because they genuinely do want to keep the public safe, but I do also agree that, you know, there are numerous cases of excessive force that we cover on the Young Turks on a regular basis, and it's definitely discouraging to see those stories. And I definitely don't like when law enforcement push for legislation that would ban people from taping them or filming them as they're arresting people. I mean, look, you are a public servant, and as a result, you should be held accountable. Our tax dollars pay for your salary. Marcy, I want to talk about police in schools. Now, there's been a lot of criticism over putting law enforcement on campuses as an effort to keep children safe. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think that the most important thing, what we have to keep in mind when we want to keep our kids safe, is to build a sense of community. And I don't think that's any different in the schools as out of the schools. We have all this militarization of our police force with hundreds of SWAT teams and very little accountability. We don't know who's got drones or what they're doing with these drones. What we need more of is really trust and building more of a co-construction of what's it going to look like to keep our communities safe. We should have workshops, we should have forums, we should have neighbors setting priorities. So I mean, I'm all for condemning the militarization of the police in the schools and out of the schools, but at the end of the day, I think we have to create something positive. What do we want to see? Right. Otherwise, we will just be buried in armor.
So we have this issue with mass shootings in the country, and you know, of course we can get into a conversation about gun control, but one response that's been proposed is putting police officers or armed guards on campuses as an effort to protect the students if there is someone who goes crazy and starts shooting. Would you say that is a decent argument to make, to have cops on campus to keep the children safe from these mass shooters?
Well, I think by and large, no. I do think there is a place for some police presence on campus, but more importantly, I think we need to create a community on the campus so that students can reach out to those who are in need. I mean, I've had students who are troubled. As an English teacher, I've read about this in their journals, and my first response would be to talk to the student, certainly if they're suicidal, if they're in harm's way, to follow up with that. And that's what we really need. We need people to be looking out for each other. We need mental health in our schools. During these budget-cutting times, there's very little of that. And that's how we keep ourselves safe. I think these efforts to arm teachers, where was that, Chicago? I forget.
Yeah, there are a number of states that are considering it.
These people really are suffering from mental health issues.
Right. Yeah, I mean,
right?
we don't.
I mean, that's insane.
I mean, usually there are conservative Republicans that are proposing this legislation, and they're the same conservative Republicans that don't believe or don't trust our students or our teachers to teach in public schools. So it's funny that you trust them with guns, you don't trust them with education. So Mike, what is the eventual outcome of this police state that we're living in?
Well, the eventual, I mean, this is, look, it's no coincidence that, and even this thing you just mentioned about using school shootings to say that more police need to be militarized. This is another example of trying to mask it in fighting crime, fighting criminality, when I think there's actually a different purpose. And I even think the massive money that's invested in it and this kind of overflow of the military-industrial complex into law enforcement, it's not just all about money either. It's, I would say that it's more about social control. It's no coincidence that we have this massive militarization of the police and this massive expansion of this government spying apparatus at the NSA, which we'll talk about later, going up at the same time that living conditions for people in the United States are continuing to be pushed down. And if we look at when this militarization of the police really started, it was in the late 60s and the early 70s, when things like white supremacy, the government, the free market, the police, the military, all these things were being opposed in the most revolutionary way. And this is when there was this massive influx of cash into law enforcement. Even looking at SWAT teams, right? The first SWAT team right here in Los Angeles, 1968, the first mission of the SWAT team was to go to war against radicals, in particular the Black Panther Party. The first act the SWAT team in LA ever carried out was raiding the offices of the Black Panther Party. And I think we have to identify that this is happening because of the anticipation of the US government of increasing radical activism against these core institutions of our society. And so I think the result of it, getting back to your question, is that there's going to be a fight. There's going to be a protracted struggle between that tiny clique of billionaires and bankers that's sitting above our government and the power that they wish to exercise and the masses of people who want a different course.
So do you feel that these actions by authorities are actually hindering political activism in the country, or do you feel that political activism is just not as, I guess, prevalent as it used to be? Because I'm noticing all of these civil liberties violations, which Jimmy Dore mentioned, and I'm noticing like so many of our rights are being violated, and the American public continues to sit back and allow it to happen. Do you feel that that's because they are already intimidated by the police state that we're living in, or do you think that it's just the way it is, and there's nothing that can be done to get Americans to stop being distracted by stories like Miley Cyrus?
Absolutely. I mean, the intent is to stop political activity. Yeah. I mean, if you go back to just look at the Occupy movement, I was one of the 7,000 people arrested during the Occupy Wall Street movement. That is a massive crushing of a political movement. When people all over the country, millions of people of all walks of life, were taking political action against very real concerns in our society. Massive unemployment, student debt, this idea of the American dream being there if you work hard, only to find that that's not the reality. People with very legitimate grievances, exercising their constitutional rights. And what did this apparatus do? There was spying on Occupy activists. The police forces used brutal violence to try to intimidate people from ever protesting again, arresting people unconstitutionally, me being one of them, and then subjecting them to inhumane and unconstitutional treatment while in prison to try to scare them from ever coming out into the streets again. And so we look back at the Occupy movement, despite its defects, that being a harbinger of what's to come, it was an example of showing what role the state plays when there are people trying to advocate for something better. They try to smash it with violence, scare people into coming out again, and that's the reason, by and large, that it doesn't exist today.
All right, well, Mike's getting me riled up right now. Jimmy, what do you think that the response should be?
Well, I just want to make one more point about it's weird that the cops don't live in the communities they police very often anymore, especially in Los Angeles, and they see the people that they're supposed to be policing as the enemy instead of part of their community, which is a big problem. And so there's this us against them mentality that the cops also have, and
which is ironic, by the way, because most cops are not wealthy. I mean, they're part of the middle class.
But it's about power.
But it is about power. It's that power struggle, and so many studies have been done that show once you give an individual power, they typically will misuse it in some circumstances.
The two types of people most likely to become policemen are the people who were bullies and the people who were bullied. So it's the people who are the most sensitive to rules, and so it can be a devil or a sinner. So they both come together, and those are the last people you want to have that kind of power, but they're the only kind of people who normally get that kind of power. And I think it's interesting that he mentioned that the banks made big donations to the NYPD Blue. Why is it when a bank gives you money to do shit they want, it's called a donation? But when I give a cop some money to do stuff I want, it's called a bribe.
Right. Yeah. That's a very, very fair point. So what would you like to see with our law enforcement? Would you like to see any type of weapons? I mean, there are some there are authorities in other countries that don't have the type of weapons that our law enforcement has. Would you like to see them without the guns, without the drones, without the, in some cases, tanks?
Certainly, and I totally support efforts to ban drones, both in our communities and overseas, where we're killing people indiscriminately with our drones. I certainly support efforts to ban tanks and grenades, which some of our police officers have.
Which is insane.
Right.
Like, the thought of a police officer throwing a grenade at you if you're growing marijuana, I mean, it's not that far-fetched. It really isn't.
But again, I don't see this as necessarily on the shoulders of the police. This is systemic. This is institutionalized, where our Defense Department is selling, War Department is selling surplus weaponry or giving surplus weaponry to police outfits that are doing what they want to do. So it really, I think it's from the top down. And as citizens, I think we have to empower ourselves and say, you know what, we're going to do surveys of our local police departments. What do you have on hand?
Yeah.
How many SWAT teams do you have? When was the last time you raided a home? What was the purpose? I mean, there's a whole litany of questions that we could ask and should be asking of our local police.
Yeah, with most issues like this, you always have to follow the money, and we have weapons manufacturers in this country, which is why we continue to go to war, which is why we continue to militarize our law enforcement, and it's a real issue. I mean, it always goes back to money and politics. It always goes back to jobs in the country. A lot of these weapons manufacturers employ people, and if we don't create more weapons, then we're going to lose more jobs. So it's definitely a tricky issue, but there's no question that police officers have no role on campus. We shouldn't be giving cops drones or tanks or grenades. We really need to reconsider all of this and create common sense legislation to keep our streets safe, because we all want to keep our streets safe, but we don't want to live in a police state in an effort to do so.